Hi everyone, and welcome to my updated Diablo 4 beginner guide in 2024. Now that the game is launching on Xbox Game Pass, I figured it would be a good time because there's probably going to be a lot of new players out there, and we have seen a lot of changes to the game since it launched back in June. So I want to talk you through how the game works, how to choose the right character class, how the skill trees and Paragon system works, what to do, and just give you general tips in how you can progress with your characters and have the best time possible. First things first, when you start up the game for the first time, you'll have to create a new character. There are 5 different classes to choose from. We have the Barbarian, the Necromancer, the Sorcerer, the Rogue, and the Druid. There's a lot of character customization. You can choose different body types and customize a lot of individual details. But in the grand scheme of things, all of these classes have a very strong class fantasy and have a very defined moveset and how they feel. So all of them are extremely different from one another, and it's definitely worth trying to explore the different classes. In general, they all feel intuitively the way you would expect when you just look at them and see their names. Like Barbarian is going to jump into melee combat. The Rogue is very fast and agile, has a bow here on the back. Necromancer obviously summons minions, has a lot of death magic, for example. Sorcerer with elemental magic. And Druid is somewhere with minions and nature skills and transformation skills. So in general, all of them have viable builds. You don't really have to worry too much about which is the best class or the weakest class. There's good builds and bad builds on all of them. So once you have made your choice, you can go and customize the character a little bit. So here, as I mentioned, you can choose some presets and then you can customize them here and do a lot of different stuff. And then you press finalize. So when you play the game on your characters, usually you want to choose a seasonal option. And there's also hardcore and skip campaign when you play season at least. I would recommend the first time you play Diablo 4, do not skip the campaign. It is actually a fairly good campaign, but usually people skip the campaign on their alts and in the future seasons. So you do this once and that's about it. You don't really have to do it, but it's really nice to play it once, I would say. So then you give it a name, you start game, and then you can also choose between seasonal and eternal realm. And if you make a fresh character, there's no reason at all to ever go to Eternal Realm. Eternal Realm is basically where after a season ends, all of your characters and your items will go. And it's parked there basically. Not many people really play on Eternal. And most of the time, a lot of the items that you have there also become obsolete with future patches because there's a lot of updates. So in the grand scheme of things, almost everyone plays Seasonal Realm. Seasons in Diablo 4 last around 3 months, plus minus a little bit. And after the season ends, you're supposed to start over in the next season from scratch at level 1. But if this is something that you don't really want to do, then there is the Eternal Realm for you, where you can go at your own pace and your character will not go anywhere. But as I mentioned, there will be updates. Sometimes, stuff breaks or becomes obsolete. So this is just what happens there. Also, you will have the choice between World Tier 1 and World Tier 2. There's also 2 more World Tiers that unlock at higher levels, where you have to complete a certain step, and then you can go to the endgame difficulties. But for the start, there's 1 and 2, where you get a bit more experience and more loot on World Tier 2. If you feel like this is too hard, you can try it out for the start, but if it's too slow or too difficult, you can easily go on World Tier 1 and just level all the way to around level 50, and then you can move on to World Tier 3. And in the later World Tiers 3 and 4, there is no choice anymore. You have to play those difficulties after that point, but for the start, you can choose an easier or harder introduction to the game. So when you load in on your character for the first time, at least after skipping campaign, you will arrive in one of the main cities. There's 5 main cities and 5 main regions on this world map. When you start out, you will have nothing explored, but here I have everything already cleaned up. And basically there's those 5 main zones here that all have sub-zones. So you see here when you mouse over them, and you can basically go and explore most of this. If you play the campaign, you're going to be here in the Fractured Peaks. This is the first main area, and then it kind of goes around the whole map here. And you're going to be in Kiowa Shard, or at least very soon you're going to arrive there. If you play in campaign skip mode, then you can go anywhere you want from level 1 basically. And you'll see there's a lot of stuff to do as well when you skip the campaign. There's, for example, these whispers here. So these are just random kind of world quests from WoW, where you can go and get certain objectives done and get a bunch of rewards. There's dungeons everywhere, so you can go there and for example, finish each of the dungeons once to, for example, unlock certain powers that you can then craft on your items. And there's a lot of other stuff to discover, like there's events, there's, you know, hidden items or hidden like shrines and rare monsters you can find. There's a lot of stuff out there in the world. One important thing to do the first time you play though is finishing your Renown. So when you complete objectives in one of these areas here, you'll earn these Renown points, and this is this interface here. I have already gathered this on all of the regions because I've been playing the game, but the first time you do this, it's a one-time completion basically to finish the Renown. And you can see this here, and you get 5 different steps, and you can get bonus skill points, you can get some other perks, and you can get bonus Paragon points that just make your character stronger. So eventually you want to have all of these 5 steps unlocked, and you do this by completing different objectives. So you can see this here, for example, there's these waypoints to give a bit of renown, discovery of areas, side dungeons, the altars of Lilith. They're also like a thing that you want to go and find. These are these altars like spread out all over the world. So we can open the filter here. So these are these little things. There's like little statues basically you can find. They're like all over the place. And you want to try to get all of these and finish the renown in all of the regions to level 5 on one character if you can. Or at the very minimum, you should try to finish level 5 renown in at least one region, only one character, before making an alt. If you want to try out different classes, for example. So you could go around in like Fractured Peaks, complete all of the stuff there, and then make an alt, and then you go, for example, here to Skullsglen, which is like this zone here, and then you finish everything there. It is shared account wide, but it's very important to do it at least once. If you are looking for a map that has all of the objectives and events and everything you can find already uncovered, you can go check out the Maxwell map here. In general, on Maxwell, if you don't know Maxwell yet, we have lots of guides, there's resource articles here, there's build guides that can help you get started. You can follow one of our builds, for example. We're updating them all the time for every major patch. And there's a lot of stuff and a lot of information to read up on and just become better and more efficient at the game. But here you can check out the map tool, for example, and here you can also see the altars. So if you don't want to search them all yourself, which can take forever, well, you can look at the map. You can also, for example, hide stuff and then only show the altars and maybe the waypoints so you kind of know your way around. And you can also see like where are the dungeons, what are the rewards for the dungeon, and so on. So it's all right here. Now let's talk about the skill trees and how do they work. So when you have a character, right now you see I have 10 points at level 1, which is from the Renown system I explained. But usually you start with 0 points, and then per level you get 1 skill point up to level 49, at which point the Paragon system starts. So the maximum character level is 100, half of it is skill points and half of it gets you Paragon points later, but I'm gonna go in that in a second. So this is the skill tree. You have different categories of skills. So you start out here, these are the basic skills, every class has these, and these are your generator skills. So you usually try to use them in tandem, try to build resources and spend resources, but not every build works exactly like that. And then usually have a bunch of other categories of skills. So on the rogue here, for example, is the agility skills. This is like a bit more class specific, but most of the time there's like maybe a mobility skill, maybe some utility stuff, some defensive stuff, depending on the class that you're playing. And then there's like different categories here of skills, basically all the way down to the ultimates and then the key passives. Ultimates are special in the way that you can only have 1 point in them and you can only use one of the ultimate abilities at a time, but not every build necessarily runs those. So a lot of people think that ultimates need to go into every build. That's absolutely not the case. You can absolutely make viable builds without them. And then down here we have the key passives, which are kind of like a very strong like bonus, like a passive bonus for your build that also kind of push your build and specialize a little bit in a certain direction. So you can also have only one of these and every build absolutely takes one of them. And sprinkled in here on the skill tree, we also have these skill upgrades. So for example, this is Puncture. This is just like a very basic rogue attack here. And then you get an enhancement. So there's always like this one thing, and then you can choose between 2 different upgrades. So it's kind of like the same story for all of the different skills I see here. It's like the main skill, then an enhancement, and then one of the upgrades. You cannot choose both of them. You only can do one of them. You also have to spend a certain amount of points to move on throughout the skill tree. As you can see here, you have like this red line. So if I take out these points again, you'll see that, for example, the core skills are locked now, and it tells you need 2 more points spent anywhere on the tree. And then here I need 6 more points and so on. And it doesn't matter where you spend these points. It doesn't matter like, you know, how many skills you take from a single category. You can have, you know, no basic skill at all. You can have 2 of them. You can have, you know, 2 core skills if you want. Usually you have 1 basic skill, 1 core skill, and then a bunch of utility skills or an ultimate or something like that. But again, this depends a little bit on the build. There's absolutely builds that even don't have basic skills. There's builds that don't have ultimate skills, and you kind of just try to mix and match stuff to make it fit. Also, throughout the skill tree, we have passive points. These are these round little things here. So if you don't really have, you know, any ability that you can boost here right now that is important for you, you can also take these passives. So there's stuff like damage reduction, movement speed, extra damage done, stuff like that, basically, just to like min-max your character a little bit. Usually at the start, you try to invest more into your main skills. So especially a certain core skill that is important for your build. So in this case, as a rogue, you can, for example, play either a melee build with twisting blades or flurry, or you can play like a bow build with barrage or rapid fire or penetrating shot. So you want to try to like invest more points into your main skill. Let's say barrage. You can put up to 5 points, and this is kind of like your main ability, and you're trying to spend this as much as possible. But you wouldn't really go and put, for example, 5 points into puncture, because this is like just mostly there for a bit of utility, maybe for a bit of chip damage, but not really your main ability. So it can be kind of a waste to like invest a lot of points into those basic skills. Maybe just do something like this here, and then instead focus more on like, you know, building up your main skill here, and then you can kind of move on, and then, you know, we take dash, for example, as a mobility skill, or we take whatever else we can find down here. The good thing is that the game has dynamic tooltips. So you can see this here, for example, as you put in points or you remove points, you see here the damage values change, and it also tells you what you gain for the next rank. So in this case, as a damage skill, you usually get a bit of extra damage for putting more ranks. There's also ways to increase the number of ranks from items, for example. So you can kind of boost certain skills more than others. And other skills also, instead of getting more damage, they have like cooldowns. For example, some mobility skills like this one here. If I put multiple points in dash, you'll see the cooldown go down. So here it goes from 12 seconds to 11.4. And then if I invest more points, it goes even further down. So there's different perks to adding more points to certain skills. If you're following any of our Maxwell guides, I can just take this one as an example here, the Barrage leveling guide. Usually we have these embeds here that show you kind of like what items you want, what legendary powers you want. I'm going to go into the legendaries in a second. And then we also have like a skill tree progression, for example. So you can see this here. This is where you start out, and then you can, you know, click here forward, and you can kind of see where do the points go. And if you want to follow a guide, then I recommend you go check those out. Let's talk about the Paragon system. So I mentioned you have a skill tree at the start, and once you're at level 50, you're going to start getting Paragon points. They work a little bit differently, and this is a bit more complex, as you can see. So per level, you get up to 4 points of Paragons. So right now this is a 100 character, but basically every quarter level you get 1 point, and you're going to have up to 225 Paragon points later. And the way that the Paragon system works is that you can kind of like build it up on your own, and you have a lot more freedom compared to the skill tree system. So what happens is you start here, this is your Paragon board, and you can start adding points. And most of these small nodes here have just like main stat, or like any of these 4 primary attributes that you can have. There's strength, int, willpower, and dex. And you just kind of like path through them until you find these bigger nodes. So there's like magic nodes. These are the blue ones. They give you like a certain benefit. For example, here's damage and life. And then you have these rare nodes that combine those in those clusters for like an even bigger bonus. You can see here, this is a lot of damage, much more life than these smaller ones. And usually try to go around and find those clusters of good stats that apply to your build. So this is the starting Paragon board. This is static on every class, but afterwards you can actually choose which Paragon board to attach. They all have different shapes and different effects and different stats to gain. And you can also rotate them. So I'm going to show this here right now. So we can click on this gate every time at the edge of the, or at the border of the Paragon board, you have these gates. And then you can click on it, and you can choose between different Paragon boards. They all have 1 legendary node and 1 socket that are important for glyphs. I'm going to go in those in a second. And then you can also see what do the rare nodes provide. So you can kind of get a bit of an idea of what does the board look like, what are the stats you can gain there, and you try to combine certain stats that apply to your build. So I mentioned this example of a barrage rogue, which is like a ranged rogue with a bow. So you might want to invest into stuff that gives you extra crit damage, because your bow builds usually go for a lot of crit, or maybe it's something like a core skill damage. Barrage is a core skill, or just maybe some extra defenses here like the life or resistances, or you have also like other perks, like for example vulnerable damage. There's like certain status effects you can apply, and then you deal more damage under certain conditions. So that always depends a little bit, but it might be easier to explain, for example, with a necromancer, where you have Paragon boards that give you minion buffs for your skeletons, for your golem, and you have other boards that give you like spell damage buffs for your blood skills. And of course, if you don't play with any minions, you would never choose a Paragon board that actually buffs your minions. So you want to try to kind of like push your build further into one direction and specialize it further as you go, and with the Paragon system you can do that. So in this case, as I mentioned, you can click on the gate once you have Path there, and then you can preview the gate, and you can see this here. So this is kind of the preview mode, and you can rotate them around as well. So there's always these 4 different entrances, and you can path through the entire board and then pick up the legendary node here if that's what you want. Or for example, you can rotate it around and try to get to the glyph socket instead, and put a glyph there, and then for example path out again on the other side. So you can always like kind of mix and match it the way you need to, and like this you build up your Paragon system later. Again, if you're following a build guide, then usually we'll have this laid out for you, for example in the Maxwell guides. So I can show this again here. So when you have the endgame guides, I'm just going to take this one here as one of mine, and we can go down to the Paragon boards, and here you can also like, just follow exactly this progression if this is what you want to do. I recommend, if you're playing the game for the first time, then it might not be such a bad idea to actually follow a guide, because it can get kind of large and a lot of things to take in here at the start. But most builds end up with somewhere between 5 to 6 Paragon boards or so, and then you pick up either some of those legendary nodes or glyphs or both, depending on what exactly you can get. But again, here you have like the progression slider, so it kind of builds up as you go, and you can easily follow along as you level up your character and unlock those more points. Now let's talk about glyphs here while we're at it. So there are these glyph sockets. As I mentioned, every Paragon board has 1 socket and 1 legendary node, and you don't necessarily always go and take both. So here's an example where I only take the glyph, but I don't take the legendary node. And there's other examples where I take the legendary, but I don't go for the glyph. But the glyphs are basically socketable, also like passive bonuses that scale with the stats that surround it. So you can see this here, for example, this is the exploit glyph. So this is a strength-based glyph on the rogue, and it gives you extra vulnerable damage. So when an enemy is vulnerable, which is a debuff you can apply, then you deal more damage to a target, and you can kind of like try to scale your vulnerable damage higher using this glyph. Or here's another one where, for example, your stun grenades deal more damage. So this is like another tool that the rogues have. And we have stuff like the tracker here, where I deal extra damage to poison targets, and then they always have like a secondary effect. And this is what you see here with this red grid. So these glyphs have a radius, and the nodes in its radius buff the glyph. And you see here, for every 5 intelligence that you have in range, you get plus 9.9% increased damage to poison targets. So that's exactly this red grid here. Also, you can level up the glyphs. So when you do nightmare dungeons, which is like a beefed up form of dungeons that you can run in the end game, then you can level up those glyphs up to 21, and they get more powerful, and then even expand in radius at level 15. So there is a bit of like a progression behind the system, both in the points that you're getting and as you build the Paragon boards, and also the glyphs themselves that you put into those Paragon boards. And again, you try to find synergies that work for your build, that boost your character power in some way, and not try to mix and match everything from all over the place. Now let's talk about the items in this game a little bit. So there are different rarities of items. This is very similar to other ARPGs, but if you have not really played them, let's just go over the basics real quick. So there are different rarities. There's white items, they're called common. There's blue items, they're called magic. There's yellow items, they're rare. And then there is legendaries that are like brown, like this, or orange. And there are unique items. They have like this beige color here. So those are the 5 different rarities of items that you can find. At the start, you're mostly going to get these white and blue items, and then very soon you're going to start replacing them with mostly these rare items. They have up to 4 stats on them, although that is about to change. There's a patch coming very soon where this whole like itemization system is about to be tweaked a little bit. So that is gonna be different in the future if you watch this, but in the grand scheme of things, rare items are better than blue items are better than white items, and then there's legendaries that are kind of like the end game items for the most part, and uniques that have usually kind of like special effects, either designed around a certain build or like something that you can't usually find. So here's an example of the Gold Slayer crown that has like, you know, a wall of text of an effect there, where you can stun enemies and pull them together and deal extra damage, or you can nuke down bosses really fast with this item, for example. But there's also kind of like skill-specific items that can be very powerful. Or here's, for example, a glove, the Frostburn, that can freeze enemies. So those are just some examples of unique item effects. And likewise, we have legendary items. And legendary items, in addition to all the stats that you can have from the rare, can give you the one legendary effect. So there can be damage buffs, defensive buffs, and you can have all kinds of things on your character to kind of like build up multiple like procs or damage bonuses that help you out. There are also multiple tiers of items. You can see this here right now. In addition to the rarities, there's also normal, sacred, and ancestral items, which unlock in the higher world tiers. So I mentioned earlier there's world tier 3 and world tier 4. Basically, those are like higher statted, like higher numbers basically of values on the stats that you can roll on your items. And later on, you have like these items here that have this glow, and they say here Ancestral Legendary Helm, for example. So those are the items you're going to have in the end game. But they also have item power, as you can see. And this item power is just a bit of a reference of kind of like the item level. So if you find like an item at level 10, that's going to be a very low item power, like 100. And if you find an item at level 100, then it's probably going to be like around 800, 900 item power, and this is kind of the maximum. So this determines how high the stats on the item can roll, but not really all too much else. So mostly bigger number is better, but the stats on the items are most of the time more important. You want to get the right stats. For example, in this case, I have a lot of resistances on my helm, and if I get another helm that doesn't have those resistances, then my character may be a lot squishier than before. So I kind of need to make sure I at least get those resistances and just trying to get a good combination of stats. It's much more important usually than just getting high item power, unless we're talking about weapons. So in the case of weapons, usually item power trumps everything, because as you can see here, this simple bow with 11 item power has 36 DPS. And then we have, for example, this crossbow here with 925 item power that has 4000 DPS. So this is obviously the end of the progression where, you know, after like dozens of hours, you're going to get these really high powered items. And in between, you're going to have, you know, weapons with a few hundred DPS and then maybe 1k, maybe 2k, and so on until you arrive at this point, which is the highest in the game. So on weapons, the item power matters more than on other pieces. But in general, you want to get higher item power, but always look at the stats. Now, one cool thing about these items is that you can actually choose the legendary powers that you're going to put on your items. I'm going to show this here. So there is an NPC in town called the Occultist, and this one is very crucial to gear up your character. So what you can do is either with rare items or existing legendary items that you find, you can imprint them with legendary powers. So the way this works is you put the item here, and then you have the Codex of Power, where you can select certain legendary powers to put on this item, in addition to all of the stats it brings. So you see here, these pants, they have potion drop rate, damage reduction, and triple damage reduction basically. And then we can put an additional legendary power on it that gives it a permanent upgrade. So you see here, it has all the same stats, the same item power, everything's the same, but now it will become a legendary item and will get this effect that we just chose. And then we imprint this, and boom, we have a legendary item now. And the good thing is you can go and do this again, or you can do this with other drops that you find, and always swap these legendary powers. And these legendary powers are usually very important to kind of like make a build, because most of the time the stats that you want on your builds are somewhat similar. Most builds want resistances and armor and life, for example. And then maybe there's like a few differences, like, you know, you want certain skill ranks on your items, but most of the time the stats are somewhat comparable between builds, but the legendary powers are what really make a build. This is where you can choose to kind of like min-max a certain skill and give it like extra effects, or you can, you know, for example, get these attack speed buffs if you want to dive into attack speed, or you can get like, you know, certain utility effects or defensive effects. And this is really where the build diversity comes to shine. So choosing the right legendary powers is really important, And again, going back to our guides here, so if you follow any guide, then usually you have like a planner linked here, and it will show you exactly what are the stats, what are the legendary powers you want, so you can follow along as well. And the thing about unique items is you cannot actually alter them at all, so they always have a fixed number of stats and a fixed like set of stats and a certain effect, and you can't go to the occultist and then print them. So unique items are kind of like locked in. You can't really do much with them besides like upgrading them a little bit. There's like, you know, certain ways to like improve the values of the stats on the items, but outside of that, uniques are kind of fixed. So that's the main difference between those and other items. Now, I mentioned there's a big update coming for itemization very soon. In Season 4, the system is going to change a little bit. The stats that you can roll in the items are going to change. There's going to be some crafting things coming up very soon, but I will cover those in separate videos because we didn't actually get to play with them very soon. It's just something that Blizzard has previewed, and we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. But there are actually some pretty massive updates coming that will change what I just explained a little bit, but I tried to explain it in a way that is future-proof. Now, lastly, let's talk about what you can actually do in the game once you have made your character and you've leveled up and you have everything available to you. So there's a bunch of different activities, and I already explained, for example, we have those whispers that are just these like outdoor activities here. You can go and do some of those. There's a reason to do them, and there's basically a reason to do everything in the game because there are certain materials that you can get from them or certain bosses you can summon. But for example, when you do these whispers, you get these so-called grim favors. And when you collect 10 of them, then you can go to the tree of whispers, which is down here. This is like this little icon here, and you can turn them in and you get a bunch of gold. You get a choice between different items. So you can kind of like target farm certain things, for example. Then we have the Hell Tide. This is this thing here. So starting in World Tier 3, there's always going to be the Hell Tide. And this is like one zone is kind of like invaded by an army of hell, and you can go there. There's like fire raining from the sky and extra elites are spawning everywhere. You can collect cinders and you can open chests with those cinders that are in this area, and you can also collect certain items there. You can get materials for crafting, for example, for rerolling your items, and also some boss summon materials. And then of course there's these dungeons here. So in addition to just like completing the dungeons and trying to get, for example, those one-time rewards, like an aspect for your codex here, you can also do nightmare dungeons. So we have these sigils here. This is, for example, a nightmare vault right now, but they work the same way. Those are basically beefed up versions of dungeons called nightmare dungeons. And they have a list of affixes that make your life harder, and they can also scale up the monsters inside those dungeons. So they're like one of the kind of like scaling difficulty systems in the game where you can challenge yourself against higher and higher level monsters and get higher level loot, get better rewards, level your glyphs, for example, in those dungeons. That's like one of the perks you can get there. And in general, they are like one of the main endgame activities right now. Then there are also world bosses. So every region has like this one little area where a world boss can spawn. You usually see an in-game timer, I think 30 minutes before. They spawn like every few hours, and you can go there and you can actually find other players there. In general, you can actually find players in the open world, at least when it's not instanced content. Sometimes you might just run into players at an event or at a boss, or when you're doing these whispers or Helltide. So there is a bit of like open world feeling, but most of the time you're not really gonna see that many people. But these world bosses are usually kind of like the most social events, and there's like these massive behemoths that you can take down, and they also give you like a one-time weekly reward, for example, and they can give you a bunch of these grim favors for your whispers, and you can get just a bunch of other like high level items, for example. So this is another thing you can do. And then there's also seasonal content that you can do. So every season usually brings like a new mechanic and new monsters and something to grind, basically, that is specific to that season. Currently, for example, we have these vaults that I just showed with these sigils. So they're like one of the season mechanics of Season 3 currently when I'm recording this video. But there will be something else in the future, and those things will not exist anymore. And every time there is usually kind of like a reason to go and farm something either in the open world or in some dungeons, and something that is like specific for that season that usually is very rewarding. So this is another thing to do. In the end, I recommend you just go out there and try out different things, see what you like. Maybe you will really like the Whispers, maybe you will really like the Helltides, or maybe it's just more of like a dungeon grinder and you're gonna do mostly dungeons. You want to do a little bit of everything, but you can kind of decide, okay, which one you want to do more than others. Maybe you can even trade for certain items that you can get from the other activities. So there's like certain kind of unique rewards that you can get from each of those, but you can also trade with other players. The main thing to be aware about is that you usually want to try to fight monsters that are either at your level or above your level, up to roughly 10 levels, because this is where you have like the optimal like XP ratio basically. You don't want to fight monsters that are below your character level, and this is also why you have to go to the higher world tiers at some point. So I mentioned at the start of the video, you can either choose Adventure or Veteran as like your first 2 difficulties, and you see here, this is for levels 1 to 50. And then after level 50 or so, you want to go to Nightmare difficulty, where it goes from 50 to 70. And then you have Torment difficulty, that's like level 70 to 100. So you kind of want to move on through the higher difficulties and make sure that you farm monsters that are actually appropriate for your character level, because else you're not going to progress at all. Some other tips that I can give you as you're leveling up your character is to make sure that you always upgrade your items. So for example, at the blacksmith, you can upgrade items and give them a bit of extra power. You can raise their stats a little bit, although that is also going to be tweaked when the itemization changes come. Then also you want to make sure you always use elixirs if you have any of them, or you can even craft them. So there's these different NPCs in town. For example, the alchemist is here, but you can also find them. So for example, you have this elixir here that gives you just a bit of extra damage against certain monster types. There's some that give you armor or life or extra damage against something. You mostly just want to try to like use any of them because they give you extra experience. Each elixir gives you 5% extra experience. You can just pop this. You have this buff on your bar. You cannot stack them, but it just helps you to gear up. And also at the alchemist, you can craft these elixirs. So you see this here, there's a lot of different ones you can craft. Basically, just choose the cheapest one and roll with it. You can collect flowers, or you can find them sometimes from quest rewards, for example. So you can kind of go around and click flowers, and you can craft elixirs. Also, you can upgrade your potion here as well. You have like a health potion that is like a default potion, and you can upgrade that as you go to give you more healing. So that's also done here at the alchemist. So you see here, there's like 10 different ranks or so, and you want to try to come back regularly, get those upgrades, and you have a better potion. The potion in general is a pretty important tool to heal up your character, at the very least early on. Later, it might depend a bit on the build. Some builds have built-in healing, others don't. Some builds have barriers, for example, so you don't really care about healing your life pool. But in the grand scheme of things, potion is a very powerful tool to keep your character alive. You can spam them, but they have only limited users, and you have to find more potion users, basically, as you defeat enemies. They drop on the ground, you can walk over them and auto pick them up, but you can't really just waste them all the time. Also, if you're playing on seasonal, there are these so-called seasonal blessings and a season journey. So a season journey is basically kind of like list of objectives that becomes harder and harder as you go. So there's like different chapters here, and there's also some one-time rewards here. For example, a bunch of codex of power aspects, so you can imprint legendaries. There's maybe some materials that you can get, some gold, some items, etc. that you get as you go. So you want to check out these challenges here and try to complete some of them as you go, so that you can get those rewards. And there's the season blessings here. So there's like a battle pass system that is like a combined free and premium track. You don't have to buy the battle pass, it's purely cosmetic. There's no gameplay advantage to getting it. But if you want to get some, cool, fancy MTX or something, there's a lot of stuff you can get here basically. And there are also some power-ups that you unlock at certain levels. So these are the seasonal blessings. They look like this. And here, for example, there's a 20% XP bonus. And here's like a boost to the shrine buff duration. And there's like some extra loot here. And you want to try to get all of these so-called smoldering ashes here from this battle pass. So as you unlock them, you want to take a look. You can see this here in this season interface. And then you want to get these XP bonuses, for example. Another tip I can give you is to use the obols. This is one of the currencies you can get here. They're called murmuring obols. They basically allow you to gamble for certain items, so you can get either lucky and get a good roll, or you get nothing. But most importantly, it's kind of useful to get legendaries and kind of unlock codex of power aspects that way. So for example, there is a certain, let's say, mobility aspect that I want to put in my boots, but I really can't find it. Then I could go and talk to this guy here, the purveyor of curiosities, and he allows you to spend those obols to get certain items. And for example, here I have 84 obols. I can try to get like a legendary pair of boots. This one here. And they always come with like one of the legendary powers. And then if this is the one I want, then I could go and then print it. And certain legendary powers go in certain slots. You can see this at your occultist. So you can actually target the right item at the occultist or at the purveyor of curiosities, and then you can go and try to get the right thing. But for example, when you imprint something, you can always see that there are certain allowed item types on the Codex of Power, and this corresponds to what you can find on legendary items as well. So for example, defensive powers only go on shield, helm, chest, pants, and amulet, and offensive powers only go on amulet, weapons, gloves, and rings, and resource only goes on rings, mobility only goes on amulet and boots, and utility goes on all of these here. So if you're ever curious about where can you find a certain power, well, you can take a look here, and there's basically certain slots you can target to get a certain power that you want. And how do you get those obols? They mostly come from side events. So as you go around, for example, we saw this here on the map, but we can turn this on. There's these event icons here, and you can kind of just like run around and try to do some of these events. It's usually not like the most efficient way of gearing up, but if you're really looking for a certain item, then this can help you out. Most of the time though, you can also just wait for a certain legendary to drop, and then you will have the Codex power and you can imprint it on whatever you want. So it kind of depends on if you really want to rush for a certain item or not. So it might also just be a bit of luck or not. Most of the time though, you can also just wait for a certain item to drop. So every item that is legendary rolls with one of these powers, and then you can go to the occultist and imprint what you want. But as I mentioned, if you really want to try to boost your luck a little bit, you can try to use those obols. Also, another tip I can give you is that you can mark items either as salvage or as favorite. You can see this here right now. Some of these items have like this like mark over them. They're grayed out. This means they are marked as trash basically. Or you can also mark them as favorite, which is the opposite. So the thing is that you can go to the blacksmith, for example, and then you can salvage all junk. So if you do this here, it will salvage all of these marked items, but it will not salvage the ones that you marked as favorite. So in general, the items that you're actually wearing, you want to mark them so you don't accidentally destroy them or throw them or something. You can't even drop them on the ground, for example. You can't even like salvage them. So you can't do anything with favorite items. It's just like a fail safe basically. But you can do it when they're not marked. So if this was an item that I really wanted to keep, well, it's gone now. So this is what you can use here. So as you find items here, you can kind of like go through your inventory and then mark them. And anything that you have looked at and you don't want to keep, well, you just mark them, and then next time you visit a blacksmith, you can get rid of them. You can also sell them to the vendor, so you can get gold instead. Both are viable options. Usually you want to salvage, at least for a while, so you get a good bank of materials, but later on you may want to sell them for gold as well. So both is viable. And if you want to look at the mats here, there's like this interface in the stats. You can click on the materials, you can kind of see how much you have. And yeah, maybe you're like really low on certain materials, you want to salvage more, or you're really low on gold, then you can sell more. And lastly, let's talk about the gems. So another NPC in town is the jeweler that allows you to craft gems, add sockets, unsocket items, and also upgrade your jewelry. So that's what I can do here. And you see here my items that have these gems in them. So you can have either empty sockets, so it looks like this. There's like one empty socket here on the helm. And then you can put these gems in there to give you like an extra stat. In this case, a ruby is plus maximum life in an armor slot, but they have different effects depending on where you put them. So if you look at this here, it says, for example, in a weapon, it's plus overpower damage, in armor, it's life, and in jewelry, it's fire resistance. Especially the jewelry options are the important ones here, I would say, because resistances are actually pretty important in this game. That works a little bit like Diablo 2 or PoE, where you have these resistance stats, and they just straight up reduce the incoming damage. You can get up to 70%, you can raise this cap up to 85 through various means, but generally you're going to have 70% resistances, at least late game. This is kind of what you're shooting for to make sure you have optimal damage reduction. So in this case, you can use these different colored gems here. See here, there's the topaz that gives lightning resistance. Here's an emerald that gives poison resistance. So you can kind of like put in exactly the gems that you need to try to max out the resistances. So generally, whenever you gear up your character, you want to take a look at these here and make sure to get to 70 on all of them as much as possible, or as close as possible at least. And then there's another important defensive stat, which is armor. So armor works a little bit unintuitively in this game, but it basically reduces all of the physical damage and it scales with the monster level. So at certain monster levels, you need certain armor values to be capped. You can get up to 85% damage reduction from physical attacks, and usually you try to get to that cap. depending on what level you are. Of course, early on this might not be possible, but as you progress and you have more tools and more options and legendaries, your armor values go up, and you usually try to hit that number. And usually the game tells you at least how much damage reduction you have against monsters of your own level. So you see this here right now, I have 8,000 armor, and it says reduces physical damage taken of enemies of equal level by 69%. Nice. But I'm quite far away from this 85% cap here, and this means I would like to, for example, boost my armor a little bit. So I can maybe just show an example here, where maybe have like another armor item like this one. So these pants here have extra armor, so if I equip them, I go to 8.9k, and now I went from 69 to 81% damage reduction. So quite a lot of extra damage reduction, just for having one extra armor roll. And in general, you try to kind of like boost your armor up as much as possible up to a certain point. Some breakpoints I can give you is 9.2 thousand is what you're shooting for level 100 monsters, and 13.4 thousand is what you're shooting for level 154 monsters, which is in the highest tier dungeons in the game, tier 100. You don't need more than that. 13.4k is totally fine, but for other monster levels in the middle, maybe you need like, for example, 11,000 or so for level 120 monsters, or you need only like 8,000 if it's like level 90 monsters. So it's somewhere around those values, and you always want to try to, have a little bit of armor, for example, from certain sources, either as a roll on your items or from certain defensive aspects. Combining capped armor and capped resistances against the elements is usually the way to go, to just build a baseline of defenses on your character. Some characters are a bit squishier, some builds are more tanky. That depends a bit on what you're playing exactly, how much you invest into defenses as well. But in the grand scheme of things, if you take a bit of a focus on these two effects here, then you usually have a well-established like layer of defense already. And then you can supplement this with, for example, barriers or dodge, or maybe some utility skills or defensive skills that give you damage reduction or something like that. And that also concludes this video here. So I hope this helps you out when you're starting out in Diablo 4. Personally, I've had a blast with the game so far, and it keeps getting better with a lot of updates that Blizzard is doing. Especially the Season 4 update is something that a lot of people are looking forward to, that, as I mentioned, changes a bunch of things about the itemization, the stats, etc. That is something that a lot of people are looking forward to, including myself. So I'm probably going to have updates for you. I'm going to cover the test realm. I'm going to cover the new season. In general, I have a YouTube channel here that has a lot of guides on Diablo. So if you ever want to look for something, then go check those out. So hope you enjoyed this video. I wish you a good start when you're going into Diablo 4, and see you guys next time.